The morning sun cast long shadows across the Marine Corps Air Station as Colonel James Mitchell stepped out of his vehicle. At 52, he carried himself with the bearing of a man who had spent 3 decades earning his stripes. His weathered face told stories of deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the silver eagles on his collar represented years of dedication to the Corps. Today was supposed to be routine, a standard briefing with the new pilot transfers. Nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to hear. The briefing room buzzed with the usual pre-meeting chatter. Young Marines shuffled through papers while senior officers reviewed flight schedules. Mitchell had seen hundreds of these sessions over the years. New pilots arrived, got their assignments, and began the long process of proving themselves worthy of marine aviation. It was a system that had worked for generations, weeding out those who couldn't handle the pressure while forging the rest into elite warriors of the sky. Among the assembled group sat Captain Sarah Chen, though Mitchell didn't know her story yet. At 28, she appeared unremarkable at first glance: average height, dark hair pulled back in regulation style, and the same serious expression worn by most junior officers trying to make a good impression. Her service record was solid but not spectacular on paper. Flight school graduate, good marks, clean disciplinary record. Nothing that would make her stand out in a room full of accomplished aviators. What the official records didn't capture was the weight she carried. Sarah had grown up hearing stories that most people would never believe. Her grandfather had been a pilot too, but not just any pilot. He had flown missions that were classified for decades, operations that had shaped the course of history. The old man had taken most of his secrets to the grave, leaving behind only fragments of stories and a single, mysterious call sign that he'd made her promise never to forget. The briefing began like any other. Mitchell worked through the standard welcome speech, explaining base procedures and operational expectations. He discussed flight schedules, maintenance protocols, and the high standards expected of Marine aviators. The younger officers listened attentively, some taking notes while others tried to look as professional as possible under the scrutiny of their new commanding officer. "Now then," Mitchell said, consulting his roster, "we'll go around the room. Each of you will state your name, previous assignment, and call sign for the group." This was tradition. Call signs were earned, not assigned, and they often came with stories that revealed character. Some were earned through exceptional skill, others through memorable mistakes. All of them meant something to the pilots who carried them. One by one, the new arrivals introduced themselves. Captain Rodriguez, formerly stationed at Pendleton, call sign Razor. Lieutenant Johnson, fresh from flight school, call sign Rookie. Standard introductions with predictable call signs that revealed nothing particularly interesting. Mitchell nodded along, making mental notes about each pilot while simultaneously reviewing the afternoon's flight schedule in his head. Then, it was Sarah's turn. She stood with the same crisp military bearing as the others, her voice clear and confident. "Captain Sarah Chen, previously stationed at Miramar." She paused for just a moment, and something in that hesitation made Mitchell look up from his papers. There was weight in that pause, as if she were deciding whether to reveal something important. "Call sign Ghost Rider." The room went dead silent. Mitchell's pen froze halfway through writing a note. Every conversation stopped. Even the air conditioning seemed to pause. In 30 years of military service, Mitchell had never heard a call sign that carried such immediate, profound impact. Ghost Rider wasn't just unusual, it was legendary. It was a name that belonged to stories told in hushed tones in officers' clubs, tales that were part myth, part classified history. Mitchell stared at Sarah, his mind racing through decades of military lore. Ghost Rider had been the call sign of a pilot from the Vietnam era, a figure so shrouded in secrecy that many believed the stories were fabricated. According to legend, Ghost Rider had flown missions that officially never happened, deep into territory that the United States had never acknowledged entering. The pilot had disappeared sometime in the early 1970s, and the call sign had been retired, not just unused, but officially retired by special order. "Excuse me, Captain," Mitchell said, his voice carefully controlled. "Did you say Ghost Rider?" He needed to hear it again, to be certain his ears weren't playing tricks on him. Around the room, the other pilots shifted uncomfortably, sensing that something significant was happening but not understanding what. Sarah met his gaze directly. Yes, sir. Ghost writer. There was no uncertainty in her voice now, no hesitation. She stood straighter, as if claiming the name had given her additional strength. Mitchell set down his pen and leaned back in his chair. In all his years of service, he had never encountered a situation like this. Call signs were serious business in aviation, they were earned through service and carried with pride. But some call signs came with history that went beyond individual achievement. Some names carried the weight of legend, and a few were considered untouchable. The silence stretched on for what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds. Mitchell found himself studying Sarah's face, looking for any sign that this was some kind of joke or mistake. But her expression remained serious, professional, and utterly sincere. She wasn't backing down from the claim, wasn't showing any indication that she had misspoken. "Captain Chen," Mitchell said finally, "that's quite a call sign. Would you care to explain how you came by it?" His tone was carefully neutral, but everyone in the room could sense the tension. This was either going to be a very short conversation ending with disciplinary action, or the beginning of something extraordinary. Sarah took a deep breath. "It's a family call sign, sir. Passed down from my grandfather." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Family call signs were virtually unheard of in modern military aviation. Call signs were earned individually, reflecting personal achievements or characteristics. The idea of inheriting one was almost unprecedented. But if what she was claiming was true, if her grandfather had been the original ghostwriter, then they were dealing with something far more significant than a simple breach of protocol. They were dealing with history that most people believed was fiction, with classified operations that had shaped the Cold War, with a legend that had influenced military aviation for generations. Mitchell realized that everyone in the room was watching him, waiting to see how he would respond. His next words would either validate Sarah's extraordinary claim or expose her as someone who had made a catastrophic error in judgment. The weight of the moment pressed down on him as he considered his options. The morning briefing had suddenly become anything but routine. Mitchell's office felt smaller than usual as he sat across from Captain Chen an hour later. He had dismissed the other pilots with instructions to report for their scheduled flights, but asked Sarah to remain behind. The conversation they were about to have couldn't happen in front of junior officers, and Mitchell suspected it might touch on matters that required significant discretion. The walls of his office were lined with the usual military memorabilia, commendation plaques, unit photos, and a few models of aircraft he had flown during his career. But today, all of that seemed insignificant compared to the young woman sitting across from his desk. If her claim was legitimate, she represented a direct connection to one of the most mysterious chapters in marine aviation history. "Captain," Mitchell began, choosing his words carefully, "I need you to understand the significance of what you're claiming. The call sign ghostwriter has a very specific history in marine aviation. It's not just unusual for someone to claim it, it should be impossible." He paused, studying her reaction. "That call sign was retired by special order in 1973. Using it without proper authorization could result in serious disciplinary action." Sarah sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap. "I understand the seriousness of the situation, sir. But I also understand the history of that call sign better than most people. My grandfather earned it during operations that were classified above top secret. He flew missions that officially never happened, in places that the United States had never acknowledged entering." Mitchell leaned forward. This was exactly what he had hoped to avoid, a conversation that could venture into classified territory. "Captain, if what you're suggesting is true, then we're discussing matters that may still be classified decades later. I need to be very careful about how we proceed." "Sir," Sarah said, "I'm not asking you to discuss classified operations. I'm simply telling you that my grandfather was Captain William Chen, USMC, and his call sign was Ghostwriter. He passed away 3 years ago, and, before he died, he told me that someday I might need to prove who I was. He said that when that day came, I should mention Operation Nightfall." The blood drained from Mitchell's face. Operation Nightfall wasn't just classified, it was legendary within certain circles of military intelligence. Mitchell had heard whispers about it during his time at the Pentagon, fragments of stories about deep reconnaissance missions during the height of the Cold War. Missions that had provided crucial intelligence but could never be officially acknowledged because they had violated international law and several treaties.
Captain Chen, Mitchell said slowly, where exactly did you hear that name?
From my grandfather, sir. He told me that if anyone ever questioned my right to carry his call sign, I should mention that operation. He said it would either validate my claim or get me in serious trouble, but that either outcome would be better than living with doubt about who I was meant to be.
Mitchell stood up and walked to his window, staring out at the flight line where Marines were preparing aircraft for the day's operations.
His mind was racing through implications and possibilities. If Sarah was telling the truth, then she was the granddaughter of one of the most significant pilots in Marine Corps history. But if she was lying or mistaken, then she had just mentioned a code name that should have been unknown to anyone without the highest level of security clearance.
Captain, I need to make some phone calls.
This conversation is now classified, and I'm ordering you not to discuss it with anyone else until I can verify your claims.
Is that understood?
Yes, sir, Sarah replied. After she left, Mitchell sat alone in his office, staring at the phone. He knew exactly who he needed to call, but the conversation was going to be difficult. General Marcus Thompson had been his mentor years ago, and, more importantly, Thompson had been involved in some of the most classified operations of the Cold War era. If anyone would know the truth about Ghost Rider and Operation Nightfall, it would be Thompson.
The call took 20 minutes to connect through secure channels. When Thompson's gravelly voice finally came through the encrypted line, Mitchell could hear the weight of age and experience.
Jimmy, Thompson said, using the informal name he had called Mitchell since he was a young lieutenant.
This is unexpected. What's so urgent that you're using secure channels? General, I need to ask you about something that might be classified.
A pilot under my command has made some claims about her grandfather, and she mentioned a name that I think you would recognize.
There was a pause on the other end of the line. Go ahead, but be careful how you phrase things.
She claims her grandfather's call sign was Ghost Rider, and she mentioned an operation called Nightfall. The silence that followed stretched for nearly 30 seconds. When Thompson spoke again, his voice had changed completely. The casual tone was gone, replaced by the carefully measured words of a man dealing with matters of national security. Jimmy, I need you to listen very carefully. I'm going to ask you some questions, and I need precise answers.
First, what is this pilot's full name and service number?
Mitchell provided the information while Thompson presumably looked something up on his end. The general asked several more questions about Sarah's appearance, her background, and her service record. Each answer seemed to surprise Thompson more than the last. Jimmy, Thompson said finally, I'm going to tell you something that has been classified for over 40 years, and I'm only telling you because the circumstances are extraordinary. There was indeed a Marine pilot with the call sign Ghost Rider. His real name was Captain William Chen, and he flew missions that were so classified that his official service record was scrubbed to remove any reference to them. Mitchell felt his heart rate increase.
So she's telling the truth? It appears so. But, Jimmy, you need to understand something. Ghost Rider didn't just fly classified missions, he flew missions that changed the course of history.
The intelligence he gathered during Operation Nightfall prevented a nuclear incident that could have triggered World War III. But those missions were so far outside the bounds of international law that they could never be officially acknowledged.
Mitchell sank back into his chair. General, what am I supposed to do with this information?
I've got a junior captain under my command who is claiming a legacy that most people think is fiction. Here's what you're going to do, Thompson said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone that had once commanded divisions. You're going to treat Captain Chen exactly like any other pilot under your command. But you're also going to understand that she carries a name that represents the highest traditions of marine aviation. Her grandfather paid a price for his service that few people could imagine, and she has every right to honor that legacy. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Thompson providing details about Ghost Rider's service that had never appeared in any official record. The original pilot had flown deep reconnaissance missions over some of the most sensitive territory in the world, gathering intelligence that had informed presidential decisions during the most dangerous period of the Cold War. He had been shot down twice, captured once, and had somehow managed to complete missions that military planners had considered suicide runs. When the call ended, Mitchell sat in his office for a long time, processing what he had learned.
Sarah Chen wasn't just another pilot with an unusual call sign.
She was carrying forward a legacy that represented the very best of marine aviation: courage in the face of impossible odds, dedication to mission accomplishment above personal safety, and the willingness to serve in ways that would never be publicly recognized or rewarded.
The next morning, Mitchell called Sarah back to his office.
This time, the conversation would be very different. Sarah entered Colonel Mitchell's office the following morning with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. She had spent the previous evening wondering whether her decision to reveal her grandfather's call sign had been wise or catastrophically foolish. The weight of the promise she had made to the old man years earlier pressed heavily on her shoulders. He had made her swear that she would honor the name Ghost Rider, but he had also warned her that doing so might come with consequences she couldn't predict. Mitchell gestured for her to sit, and she noticed immediately that his demeanor had changed. The stern, questioning authority figure from yesterday had been replaced by someone who seemed to be seeing her for the first time. There was respect in his eyes that hadn't been there before, mixed with something that looked almost like awe. "Captain Chan," he began, "I've spent the last 18 hours making phone calls and verifying your story. What I've learned has fundamentally changed how I view your presence in my command." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Your grandfather was indeed the original Ghost Rider, and his service record is one of the most remarkable I've ever encountered, even in its heavily redacted form." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her, followed immediately by a surge of pride. For 3 years since her grandfather's death, she had carried his stories and his call sign like a sacred trust, never entirely certain whether she was honoring a genuine hero or perpetuating family mythology. Now she knew the truth. "However," Mitchell continued, "with that validation comes responsibility that I'm not sure you fully understand. Your grandfather's missions during the Cold War weren't just classified, they were legendary within certain circles of military intelligence. The name Ghost Rider carries expectations that go far beyond normal pilot performance standards." Sarah straightened in her chair. "Sir, my grandfather prepared me for this. He didn't just tell me stories about his service, he trained me. Every summer from the time I was 12 until I joined the Marines, he taught me things that weren't in any flight manual. Navigation techniques that could get you home when all your instruments failed. Survival skills for situations that official training never covered. Most importantly, he taught me that being Ghost Rider meant being willing to accept missions that other pilots couldn't or wouldn't take." Mitchell studied her carefully. "Captain, what I'm about to tell you cannot leave this office without proper authorization. Your grandfather didn't just fly reconnaissance missions. He flew what we call deniable operations, missions that were so sensitive that if he had been captured or killed, the United States would have denied any knowledge of his activities. He volunteered for assignments that had survival rates below 20%. "I know, sir," Sarah replied quietly. "He told me that Ghost Rider wasn't just a call sign, it was a commitment to serve in ways that most people couldn't imagine. He said that someday, if I proved worthy of the name, I might be asked to make similar commitments." The conversation was interrupted by a knock on Mitchell's door. His aide entered and whispered something that made the colonel's expression grow serious. "Captain Chen, it appears that your arrival here wasn't as coincidental as either of us thought. I've just been informed that there are some people who would like to speak with you." 30 minutes later, Sarah found herself in a secure conference room with 2 individuals who had introduced themselves only by first names. Agent Davis was a woman in her 40s with prematurely gray hair and eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of their surroundings. Agent Martinez was younger, probably early 30s, with the build of someone who spent significant time in the gym and the alertness of someone accustomed to dangerous situations. "Captain Chen," Davis began, "we understand that you've recently claimed the call sign Ghost Rider. We also understand that Colonel Mitchell has verified your family connection to the original pilot who carried that name. What you may not realize is that your grandfather's legacy extends beyond his Cold War service." Martinez opened a briefcase and pulled out a file folder marked with classification stamps that Sarah had never seen before. Your grandfather established certain protocols during his service, protocols that were designed to identify and evaluate potential successors to his unique mission set. Your appearance here, with his call sign and knowledge of Operation Nightfall, has triggered those protocols. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. What kind of protocols? The kind that determine whether you're worthy of carrying on more than just his call sign, Davis replied.
Your grandfather didn't just fly missions for the Marine Corps, Captain.
His work contributed to a joint military intelligence program that still exists today. When he retired the Ghost Rider name, he made provisions for it to be passed on to someone who could meet the same standards he had maintained.
The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow.
She had always known that her grandfather's service had been extraordinary, but she had never imagined that claiming his call sign would connect her to ongoing operations.
Are you saying that using his call sign was some kind of application?
In a sense, yes, Martinez said. Your grandfather established a series of tests and evaluations that would determine whether his successor had the skills, judgment, and dedication necessary to carry on his work. By claiming the Ghost Rider name and demonstrating knowledge that should have been unknown to anyone outside the program, you've essentially volunteered for those evaluations.
Davis leaned forward. Captain, we want to be very clear about something. You are under no obligation to proceed with this process.
You can continue to serve as Ghost Rider in a purely ceremonial sense, honoring your grandfather's memory without taking on the responsibilities that originally came with that name. But, if you choose to pursue the full legacy, you need to understand that it will fundamentally change your military career. Sarah sat in silence for several minutes, processing what she had just heard. She thought about her grandfather's final words to her, his insistence that she remember not just his stories but the principles that had guided his service. He had told her that someday she would face a choice between safety and service, between a normal military career and something that would demand everything she had to give.
What would these evaluations involve? She asked finally. Martinez smiled for the first time since entering the room. They would test every skill your grandfather taught you and several he probably didn't.
Navigation, survival, combat flying, but also intelligence gathering, resistance to interrogation, and decision-making under extreme pressure. The failure rate is approximately 70%, and even those who pass face career paths that involve significant personal sacrifice. But, Davis added, those who succeed carry on a tradition of service that has contributed to national security in ways that will never be publicly acknowledged. They become part of a select group of aviators who handle missions that conventional military units cannot or will not undertake. Sarah closed her eyes and pictured her grandfather's face during one of their last conversations. He had been dying then, weakened by decades of exposure to chemicals and stress that his doctors couldn't fully explain. But his eyes had still held the fire that had driven him to volunteer for impossible missions, the dedication that had made him willing to disappear into legend rather than seek recognition for his accomplishments. When would these evaluations begin? She asked.
Immediately, if you choose to proceed, Martinez replied.
But, Captain, you need to understand that once you begin this process, there's no going back to a normal military career. Win or lose, you'll be part of a classified program that will affect every assignment you receive for the rest of your service. Sarah opened her eyes and looked directly at Davis. My grandfather spent his entire adult life serving his country in ways that he could never discuss with his family. He died knowing that his greatest accomplishments would never be recognized, and that the missions he flew would remain classified long after everyone involved was dead. If I'm worthy of carrying his call sign, then I'm worthy of carrying his responsibilities as well. Davis and Martinez exchanged a look that suggested Sarah had just passed the first test.
Very well, Captain Chen, Davis said. Welcome to the Ghost Rider program. Your evaluations begin tomorrow at 0500 hours.
The alarm clock showed 0430 when Sarah woke, though she had been lying awake for the past hour. Sleep had been elusive as her mind raced through everything that had happened in the past 48 hours. Yesterday morning, she had been just another Marine pilot reporting to a new assignment. Now she was about to begin evaluations that would determine whether she could carry on her grandfather's legendary work. The evaluation facility was located in a section of the base that Sarah had never seen before, accessible only through checkpoints that required special authorization. Agent Martinez met her at the final security gate, his expression serious in the pre-dawn darkness. "Good morning, Captain Chen," he said as they walked toward a nondescript building. "Today begins a process that typically takes 6 weeks to complete. You'll be tested on everything from basic flying skills to advanced intelligence techniques. Some of the evaluations will be obvious, others you may not even realize are happening until they're over." They entered a briefing room where Agent Davis was waiting along with 3 other individuals Sarah didn't recognize. A Marine lieutenant colonel with aviator wings and the weathered look of someone who had seen combat. A woman in civilian clothes whose bearing suggested intelligence background. A man who appeared to be in his 60s, with silver hair and eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. "Captain Chen," Davis began, "meet your evaluation team. Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez will assess your flying abilities under stress conditions. Dr. Sarah Patterson will evaluate your psychological fitness for classified operations. And, this is Robert Chen, no relation, despite the shared surname, who served with your grandfather during some of his most sensitive missions." Robert Chen stepped forward, and Sarah immediately understood why her grandfather had spoken of certain colleagues with such deep respect. This man radiated the quiet confidence of someone who had faced impossible situations and emerged intact. "Captain," he said, "your grandfather was one of the finest pilots I ever flew with. More importantly, he was one of the most ethical people I ever served alongside. We're going to find out if those qualities run in the family." The first evaluation was straightforward, a flight test in an F/A-18 Hornet configured with sensors and monitoring equipment Sarah had never seen before. She was given a complex navigation problem that required flying through several restricted airspace areas while maintaining radio silence and avoiding simulated surface-to-air missile sites. What started as a routine test flight quickly became something far more challenging. 30 minutes into the flight, her primary navigation system failed. 20 minutes later, her radio went silent. By the time she was dealing with a simulated engine fire, Sarah realized that the malfunctions were all planned components of the evaluation. She drew on everything her grandfather had taught her during those summer training sessions. Navigation by dead reckoning when instruments failed. Flying by instinct when visibility dropped to near zero. Most importantly, maintaining mission focus even when everything was going wrong simultaneously. The flight lasted 4 hours and covered nearly 800 miles of some of the most challenging terrain in the American Southwest. When she finally touched down at a remote airstrip that wasn't on any of her charts, Sarah felt both exhausted and exhilarated. She had completed the mission objectives despite equipment failures that would have grounded most pilots. Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez was waiting when she climbed down from the aircraft. His expression was carefully neutral, but Sarah caught what might have been approval in his eyes. "Interesting approach to the navigation problem, Captain. Your grandfather used a similar technique during a mission over North Vietnam in 1971. The psychological evaluation with Dr. Patterson was less dramatic but, perhaps more challenging. Hours of interviews, psychological tests, and scenario-based questions designed to probe her decision-making processes under extreme stress. The doctor was particularly interested in Sarah's motivations for claiming her grandfather's call sign and her willingness to accept the responsibilities that came with it. "Captain," Dr. Patterson asked during one session, "suppose you were captured during a classified mission that your government could not acknowledge. You would face interrogation, possibly torture, with no prospect of official rescue. Your family would be told that you died in a training accident. Are you prepared for that level of sacrifice?" Sarah thought about her grandfather's stories, the missions he had flown knowing that capture or death would be met with official denial. "Doctor, my grandfather faced that exact situation multiple times. He told me that the key wasn't being unafraid, it was being more committed to the mission than you were afraid of the consequences." The most challenging evaluation came from Robert Chen. Unlike the others, his assessment couldn't be completed in a controlled environment. Instead, he subjected Sarah to a series of real-world scenarios designed to test her judgment, ethics, and ability to operate in moral gray areas. One exercise involved a simulated intelligence-gathering mission in a foreign country. Sarah was given false documentation and a cover story, then tasked with making contact with a foreign asset who had information critical to national security. What she didn't know until later was that the entire scenario was designed to test whether she would cross ethical lines when pressure was applied. Your grandfather, Robert explained afterward, had opportunities to compromise his principles for mission success. He never did, even when it meant accepting mission failure. That moral consistency was what made him effective in the long term.
Intelligence assets trusted him because they knew he wouldn't betray them for temporary advantage.
Week after week, the evaluations continued. Sarah flew missions in weather that grounded commercial aviation.
She completed survival exercises in environments that tested the limits of human endurance.
She practiced resistance to interrogation techniques that pushed her to psychological breaking points. But the hardest test came in the fourth week, when she was given a classified briefing about a current international crisis. The information was real, the stakes were genuine, and the mission profile was similar to those her grandfather had flown decades earlier. She was told that if she continued with the evaluation process, she might be called upon to fly similar missions in the near future.
Captain Chan, Agent Davis said during the briefing, "This is your last opportunity to withdraw from the program without prejudice.
If you continue, you'll be committed to accepting assignment to missions that may require you to operate outside normal military channels. You'll be part of a program that exists in the spaces between official military operations and civilian intelligence activities."
Sarah looked around the briefing room at the faces of people who had spent weeks testing every aspect of her capabilities.
She thought about her grandfather's legacy, not just the heroic stories but the decades of quiet sacrifice that had followed his active service. She considered the career she was giving up, the normal progression of assignments and promotions that define most military careers. "Sir," she said finally, "my grandfather used to tell me that some things were worth any sacrifice. He believed that serving your country meant being willing to disappear into legend if that's what the mission required."
"I'm ready to make that commitment."
Robert Chen smiled for the first time since the evaluations had begun.
"Captain, your grandfather would be proud. You've passed every test we've given you, including several you didn't know you were taking.
But, more importantly, you've demonstrated the same ethical foundation that made your grandfather effective in impossible situations." Agent Martinez opened a secure briefcase and withdrew a flight suit unlike any Sarah had ever seen. The name tape read Chan and, below it, in understated block letters, was the call sign that had started this entire journey, Ghost Rider.
"Captain Sarah Chan," Agent Davis said formally, "welcome to the Ghost Rider program. Your first operational assignment begins in 72 hours.
6 months later, Colonel Mitchell stood in the same briefing room where Sarah Chen had first revealed her call sign. The morning sun cast familiar shadows through the windows, but everything else had changed. The young captain who had quietly claimed her grandfather's legendary call sign was no longer under his command. She had vanished into the classified world of special operations, leaving behind only official documentation of a transfer to special assignment duties. Mitchell had received periodic updates through secure channels, carefully worded reports that told him Sarah was excelling in her new role without revealing any operational details. He knew she had completed her evaluations successfully and had been accepted into the Ghost Rider program. Beyond that, her activities were classified at levels far above his clearance. The briefing room door opened, and Agent Davis entered, followed by Robert Chen and another man Mitchell didn't recognize. Their expressions were serious, but Mitchell detected an undercurrent of satisfaction that suggested good news. "Colonel Mitchell," Davis began, "we wanted to brief you on Captain Chen's progress and provide some context for what her assignment to your base actually represented." She gestured to Robert Chen, who opened a classified briefing folder. "Colonel," Robert said, "what I'm about to tell you is classified, but you've earned the right to know the full story. Captain Chen's arrival at your base wasn't coincidental. We had been tracking her military career since she graduated from flight school, waiting to see if she would claim her grandfather's call sign." Mitchell leaned forward. "You knew who she was before she got here?" "We've known about Sarah Chen since she was 18 years old," the third man said, introducing himself as Director Williams from an agency whose name Mitchell couldn't have guessed. "Her grandfather established protocols before his death to identify and evaluate potential successors. Sarah's academic performance, flight training records, and psychological profiles all indicated she might be suitable for the program.
Davis pulled out a photograph that took Mitchell's breath away.
It showed a young Marine pilot standing next to an aircraft, his face bearing an unmistakable resemblance to Sarah. Below the photo was a caption, Captain William Chen, USMC, call sign Ghostwriter, 1971. The original Ghostwriter completed 43 classified missions between 1969 and 1973, Robert explained. His work provided intelligence that influenced presidential decisions during some of the most dangerous moments of the Cold War. When he retired the call sign, he made provisions for it to be passed on to someone who could maintain the same standards.
How has Captain Chen performed? Mitchell asked. Williams smiled.
Colonel, in 6 months of operational assignments, Captain Chen has exceeded every performance metric we established. She's completed 7 missions in 3 different theaters of operation. More importantly, she's maintained the ethical standards that made her grandfather legendary within intelligence circles.
Davis opened another file. Her first mission involved reconnaissance over a disputed territory where conventional military aircraft couldn't operate without triggering an international incident.
She spent 18 hours in hostile airspace, gathering intelligence that prevented a regional conflict from escalating into something much larger. Her second mission, Robert continued, required her to make contact with an intelligence asset in a country where American military personnel weren't supposed to exist. She not only completed the intelligence transfer but extracted the asset when his cover was blown, saving the life of someone who had been providing critical information for over a decade.
Mitchell felt a surge of pride mixed with amazement.
The young pilot he had briefly commanded had proven worthy of one of the most legendary call signs in military aviation. But, more than that, she had honored the legacy while creating her own. Colonel, Williams said, Captain Chen has asked us to convey a message to you. She wanted you to know that your support during those first critical days was essential to her success. Your decision to verify her claims rather than dismiss them made it possible for her to pursue her grandfather's legacy.
There's something else, Davis added.
Captain Chen has been selected for a special assignment that will define the next phase of the Ghostwriter program. She's been chosen to establish training protocols for a new generation of pilots who will carry on this tradition. Mitchell realized that Sarah's story had come full circle. She had claimed her grandfather's call sign, proven worthy of its legacy, and was now positioned to pass that legacy on to others.
The Ghostwriter name would continue, carried forward by pilots who understood that some forms of service required complete anonymity. Will I see her again? Mitchell asked.
Robert smiled. Probably not in any official capacity. But, Colonel, you should know that you played a crucial role in continuing one of the most important traditions in American military aviation. Your decision to take her seriously, to verify her claims instead of dismissing them, made it possible for the Ghostwriter legacy to continue. After the briefing, Mitchell returned to his office and sat quietly for a long time. He thought about that morning 6 months earlier when a young captain had stood up and claimed a call sign that most people believed was fiction. He had witnessed the beginning of a legend, and he realized that the military was full of such moments, quiet instances of courage and dedication that would never be publicly recognized but would shape history in ways that few people would ever understand. Somewhere, Sarah Chen was carrying forward her grandfather's legacy, flying missions that officially didn't exist, serving her country in ways that would remain classified long after she was gone. She had become what her grandfather had always been, a ghostwriter, moving unseen through the shadows of history, making sacrifices that would never be acknowledged for causes that would never be forgotten by those who understood their importance. The call sign lived on, carried by someone worthy of its weight.
And, in the end, that was what mattered most.
3 years later, in a classified facility in another part of the world, Captain Sarah Chen, now Major Chen, stood before a group of young pilots. They were the most promising aviators from branches of service around the world, selected for their skills, their psychological fitness, and their dedication to service above self. Today, she told them, you'll learn about a tradition that has existed in military aviation for over 50 years. You'll learn about pilots who served without recognition, who completed missions that officially never happened, and who made sacrifices that their families could never fully understand. One of the young pilots, a Navy lieutenant with sharp eyes and nervous energy, raised his hand.
Major, what call sign will we earn if we complete this program?
Sarah smiled, thinking of her grandfather, of Colonel Mitchell, and of all the pilots who had carried impossible burdens for necessary causes.
That depends on what you're willing to sacrifice for the mission.
But, I can tell you this, the call signs you earn here will be ones you carry for the rest of your lives. The Ghost Rider legacy continued, passed from one generation to the next, carried by those who understood that some forms of service required everything a person had to give. And, somewhere, looking down on them all, the original Ghost Rider smiled, knowing that his granddaughter had honored not just his call sign, but the principles that had made it legendary.